So now that we have established how to calculate real interest rate, we are going to have to take a look at the ICE relation. Okay. Now, so the question is, which interest should we use in the ICE curve? The nominal or the real? Or effectively, which inflation should the central bank try to adjust in their monetary policy? And the answer is straightforward, is that central banks will control IT while adjusting for inflation. So when the central bank is adjusting the nominal interest rate, of course, they're going to keep a mind into inflation and what inflation is expected in the economy. And based on that, what the real interest will be faced by the customers. So effectively, what the central bank is doing is that they're trying to adjust RT. They're increasing or decreasing IT, of course, but they're trying to change IT in a way that RT ends up in the level in which they have. So for example, they may have a target that they want RT to be 5%. But of course, central bank cannot just change RT. RT depends on the inflation. So what the central bank is going to do is they're going to take the expected inflation, and based on that expected inflation, they're going to change IT. So for example, the central bank expects inflation in the economy to be 3%, okay? And of course, they want RT to be 5%. So let's bring down the equation we had. We saw that RT is equal to IT minus pi t plus 1e. So let's fill in these things. Central bank wants this to be 5%, and they know that this is going to be 3%. So as a result, what they will do is they will set IT equals to 8%. Although the central bank don't really care about IT being 8%, 9%, 10%, it doesn't matter to them. But what they do know is that if they set IT to 8% with 3% inflation that is expected, RT is going to reach 5%, which is what they want. So this is how central bank is going to operate. Okay, so the distinction between these two is that you cannot directly change RT, but of course you make your decisions on how to change IT based on what you want RT to be. But, and this is a but, there is a big issue here, and that is the problem of liquidity trap that we had already talked about. Okay, so here's the thing. RT, we know R is equal to I minus pi. Now, we also know that I must be greater than or equal to 0, right? Nominal interest rate cannot be less than 0%. A bank cannot tell us that if you save money with us, we're going to charge you interest. They cannot say if you borrow money from us, we're going to give you money. It doesn't work that way. We are bounded from the bottom. This, if you remember, was called zero lower bound, or ZLB for short. We have this. If we have this, then the lowest that the real interest can go is minus of inflation, right? I mean, if I is 0, then the lowest R can go to is minus the inflation rate and no lower than this. And the problem with this is that let me just give you guys some examples. So suppose inflation is very high, so 20%. Suppose inflation is moderate. Suppose there is no inflation. And suppose we have deflation, minus 10%. Let's take a look at this 4 cases, okay? If inflation, not interest, sorry. So inflation. So if inflation is very high, 20%, then the lower that the real interest can go to is minus 20%. So of course, that's a very high, or rather a very low interest rate, real interest rate. We will never need to go, we haven't yet actually had to go this low for interest rate. This are minus 5. We may have to go down this low for monetary policy. This we have already. What if we don't have any inflation? Then the lowest that the real interest can go to is 0%. And in this case, if we have deflation, the lowest that the real interest can go to is 10%. And this is the problem. See, is that if we have deflation, real interest rate cannot fall below 10%. And that means that monetary policy, depending on what level of inflation we expect in the economy, monetary policy will face different levels of liquidity trap. In this case, liquidity trap does not come into effect until real interest rate falls to minus 20%. It's very, very unlikely that this will happen. In this case, not until real interest rate is minus 5%. Even this is quite unlikely. But over here, we face a liquidity trap the moment real interest rate gets to 0%. And over here, as the moment real interest rate reaches 10%, liquidity trap comes in. And so that's a very bad situation for the central bank to be in, is that they cannot lower interest rate any lower than 10%, which means very quickly monetary policy is going to become ineffective in combating certain economic scenarios, and the government will then only have to use fiscal policy and not monetary policy anymore. So remember, I'm not talking about this because we have talked about this in chapter 5, but remember, what does monetary policy do? Monetary policy, it changes the interest rate or the money supply to achieve certain economic objectives, right? So we have interest here, y here, we have IS, suppose we have LN. Okay. Now the problem is that if we are facing a scenario such as this, for example, okay, where we have had 10% deflation, and so real interest cannot fall below 10%. So here's what happens. Suppose we have entered a recession, and because of that, investment has fallen and ICE curve has shifted. So we were here, now we have arrived here. How do we solve this problem? One way could have been for us to lower the interest rate, get to this point, let's call it LM prime, and we would have been back here, right? And so output would have gone back to the same level. But if we have a bound such as this, suppose interest was 12%, and then we see that this is where we are, 10%, let's use another ink, and this is the lowest that we can reduce our interest rate. Interest rate cannot go any lower than 10%, which means that we are stuck in this position. So output was Y0. From Y0 we went to Y1, and now we are at Y2. Okay, and Y2 is definitely better than Y1, but because of this liquidity trap that we are stuck in, because nominal interest cannot fall below 0%, which means that in this case real interest rate cannot fall below 10%, we can no longer go back to Y0. That is not allowed to us. And so this is a problem that we experience during periods of deflation or even low inflation. So we'll talk about this more in a later video.